9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 3. Truth Never Seen. The sun had barely risen over the rocky horizon when 9 sat up, staring out over the landscape. He hadn't slept at all. However, he made sure not to wake the twins or 7. He brought his knees to his chest, watching the sunrise filter through the opaque pink clouds. The only sounds he heard were the soft breathing of his companions and the eerie wind blowing through the city. He sat quietly until 7 woke. She stretched strongly, then sat up. 7 looked over at 9 and was about to greet him, but stopped herself. She could see right away that there was something wrong. Very wrong. 9, are you okay? She asked him softly. Leaning towards him, her heart seemed to skip a beat when she saw his emotionless face and blank eyes. This was an emptiness, a sadness that she had seen in his eyes too many times before. He'd always try to keep it to himself and never worry the others, but she always knew. I'm fine, he murmured. He didn't even spare her a glance, keeping his strangely lifeless eyes fixed on the horizon. 7 blinked, her brow furrowing a bit. She then turned away and gave 3 and 4 each a small shake on the shoulder to wake them. They opened their eyes, and 3 gave a wide yawn. 9 was eerily silent, entirely silent, as they all got up and resumed their trek once more. The twins didn't play around as they had yesterday. They stayed nervously by 7's side, giving anxious glances at 9 every so often. They noticed his unusual quietness, sensed his sadness. He didn't smile at all and kept his eyes to the ground. This frightened the twins and 7. No matter how sad he became, 9 tried to never show it in front of them. He knew they worried about him, and he didn't like to frighten them. This was incredibly unusual for 9. They kept walking in silence. 9 didn't speak at all, and 7 was becoming increasingly nervous. She had no idea what was wrong, but something obviously was. "9, what's the matter?" she finally asked him. She stopped a small group, unable to let her friend so sad any longer. 9 sighed, looking up at 7 at last. He had been battling his thoughts this entire time, to tell 7 to, or keep it to himself, and decided it was just a dream. She would think he was crazy. She would never believe him. It's hard to explain, he said, rubbing the back of his head and turning away again. 7's brow knitted. 9 was acting very strange. He usually never kept things from her. "I'm sure we can keep up," 7 replied, a small bit of contempt in her voice. 9 sighed and turned to her, looking deep into her eyes. This was something that could change their lives, and change them for the better. He knew how much 7 and the twins missed their friends. They could all be happy together. They could become a family he'd been wishing for so long. "Last night, something happened to me," 9 began, keeping his eyes locked with 7's. "I was taken somewhere. I left my body while we were sleeping. I didn't know where I was, but He paused, hoping beyond hope that what he was saying was true. "I saw 5. Seven blinked, and a look of surprise crossed her face. Nine couldn't stop himself now, allowing emotion to overtake rational thought. I saw 5 and all the others. They've been trapped in a world in between here and where they were supposed to go. They haven't been able to move on. They've been waiting for me so that they could tell me how I can bring them back. Nine unzipped his chest, reached inside, and pulled out the talisman. He glanced down at the device that could both give and take away life. He then looked out across the landscape as he held the talisman closely. Something deep inside him, beyond heart and soul, told him that this was real. He had a second chance. We can bring them all back. 5 showed me the sequence that will bring their souls back to their bodies. I know it was real. It was just too real. I can't leave them trapped. We need to find them and bring them home, he finished softly. He continued to stare out across the dead land, his focus locked on the new mission at that moment. There was an uneasy silence until Nine felt a small hand on his shoulder, squeezing slightly. Nine, I know you really miss 5. I know you miss everyone. I do too. But there's nothing we can do. They're gone. They're free now, she said sympathetically, reaching up with her other hand and grasping his arm. Nine shook his head and turned away, removing his arm from her grasp. He put the talisman back inside his chest where he could keep it safe, zipping himself up. No, it was too real. I was really there. I have to been. I know this sounds insane, but you weren't there. I could hear them. I felt them. I could just make this up, even if I wanted to. 7, they're not free. They need to come back, or else they'll be trapped forever. I can't let that happen. It's my fault they're dead in the first place. And if I just let them stay trapped when I can do something about it. No, not again, he said, shaking his head. 7 scoffed softly, stepping towards him. The twin stood still, watching the two and speaking quietly. Could this be real? Could their beloved friends come back to them after they were supposed to be gone forever? It would just be a waste of time. A huge waste of time. We need to find somewhere to live. Somewhere where we'll be safe. It's just us now, and they're gone, 7 said, her voice becoming firm. She stepped in front of 9, blocking his path. It wasn't real. I have to. For the first few days, when I finally awoke, I didn't know what I was doing. I awakened the machine. I let them die. This time, I know what I must do. I must trust my instincts. For them. 9 contradicted, reaching up and grasping her shoulder gently, hoping to sway the stubborn woman to understand him. She had to understand. Nothing was going to stop him. He was going to save them and give them back the life they had been taken away. 7's figure stiffened. Her eyes hardened. She shook his hand from her shoulder. No! What if you're wrong, 9? And nothing happens? She asked scornfully. Then it happens. But it's a chance that I'm going to take, 9 replied, matching her gaze. If only she understood. He then relaxed a bit, reached up, offered her his hand to try to appeal to the woman who had become his best friend. Please come with me. I don't want to do this alone. I need you guys with me. Instead of taking his hand, 7 glanced at him. Her face became stony with anger as she brushed away his hand. You're being stupid. It would just be a waste of time, and it would put us in even more unnecessary danger. I'm gonna find a home for the twins. They've been through enough. And so have you and I. You're not going to accomplish anything by hurting yourself even more, Seven argued, her voice becoming stronger. It was so very rare that she was angry with 9. And it nearly frightened him. He had never been at odds with 7, but his heart stood strong, and he had already made his decision. Straightening his fingers curled into fists. I'm not going to let them remain trapped. If there is a chance I can help them, no matter how small, I have to take it. Don't you want them back too, 7? Then help me. But I can't wait any longer. The only time I wasted is not looking for them. Since 9 said firmly, fixing her with an intense stare. It had been 3 months since they had been lost. Who knew how badly their bodies were ravaged? I knew if he stayed much longer, there was a chance he'd be too late. You're only doing this because you don't want to feel guilty anymore. And you've seen that as a reason to keep us out here, exhausting us? 7 shouted and tensed. 9 blinked, even taken aback by her words. Her anger overshadowed any rational thought, and he felt his temper boil over. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it because it was my fault that they were murdered. I had to fix this. I'm never going to hurt them again, 7, and I let them remain trapped. And letting them remain trapped is just as bad as letting them die. 9 yelled. His voice echoed across the landscape. The twins clung to each other, staring an apprehensive glance. They never, ever seen 9 yell at 7 like this. He was such a docile, kind person, but his words merely indicated the severity of the situation. Perhaps that really they could come back. However, 7 didn't share that thought. 9's shout had startled her into a shock, enraged silence. She inhaled sharply and spoke after a few moments. Her voice was low, but her words were laced in ice. Fine. Leave us. You shouldn't have stayed with us. You're the one who caused them all to die. They are all we've got. She pointed vehemently at the twins, who flinched at their mention. And I'm not gonna endanger them to follow some pointless recklessness just so you can redeem yourself. 9 froze. His anger immediately melted away. He felt like he had been burned alive. Each word she spoke thrashed him like a whip of fire. 7, the stitch punk he was closest to, the one who'd forgiven him for what he'd done, stayed by his side the whole time, had just disavowed him, banished him. No, this couldn't be. 7, he said softly, his heart falling. He lifted a trembling hand and reached for her. Find us when you finally got it through your thick head that you're being stupid. Or don't. I don't care. Get away. Go! She said, turned her back on him sharply and walked away. 9 stood there, stunned, staring after her. She didn't want him with them. She hated him now. A deep, dark wave of shock, sadness crashed over him, crushing him painfully. His last friend turned her back on him, wanting nothing more to do with him. And it was his fault. He glanced down at the twins, who stared back. Their pleas for him to stay were evident in their eyes. 9 slowly looked back up at 7, hoping that she was looking at him again, hoping that she was going to give him a chance to apologize. However, she just kept walking, her scarred back facing him. She didn't look back once as she headed into the city. Nine bent his head, ashamed and heartbroken. All he wanted to do now was apologize for every word he said. He couldn't lose her. But Seven didn't care, and she never wanted to see him again. There was nothing he could do. Turned around, he began to walk away slowly, feeling the sadness rip him from the inside out. He soon broke into a run, racing away from the others, each breath coming out like a sob. 3 and 4 watched him run until he finally disappeared into the far-off distance. 4 took a few steps forward, reaching after him. He turned to 3 and beamed to his brother anxiously, his lower lip quivering. 3 looked after 9 miserably, but then shook his hooded head. 4 sighed, and the two decided against following him. With hung heads and dejected hearts, they quickly caught up to 7 as they headed back into the city. 9 stopped running around mid-evening. He had only stopped a few times to catch his breath before continuing on. He didn't know where he was going or how he was going to get there. He only knew he had to somehow find the 5 fallen Stitchpunks. He stopped, gasping and completely lost. He bent down, hands on his knees as he caught his breath. After a moment, he looked around, uncertain and nervous. He didn't recognize anything here at all. The sadness of Seven's words had overwhelmed him, and he just ran away, blindly. He hadn't the slightest idea where he was or how he was going to start his mission. He now regretted the decision to run off, but there was no turning back. He knew what he needed to do, and that knowledge drove him onward. This place was extremely unfamiliar, mostly wasteland. Dead pine trees stood tall, the trunks thick with ash, and dead, blackened branches reached out. The ground itself was nothing but stone and dirt. The gas from the mech walkers long ago prevented grass and leaves from returning to a once beautiful forest. 9 walked around slowly, uncertain. He looked all around, trying to find something that he'd recognize. Not watching where he was going, he suddenly pitched forward with a cry, nearly walking off the edge of the path. 9's arms flailed as he tried desperately to regain his balance. He just managed to fall backwards, landing on his rump, breathing heavily and blinking. 9 struggled to catch his breath. Startled, he felt rather miserable. Suddenly, he heard something. A noise he had never heard before. It was soft but beautiful. Leaning forward, 9 peered over the edge. It was soft but beautiful. Leaning forward, 9 peered over the edge. There was a large river and a small ravine that he had almost slipped into. As he looked over the edge, he saw that the river was very shallow. Stones littered the bed. The water flowed smoothly and slowly, creating the softest sound. 9 looked down, curious and mystified. He'd never seen a river except in old paintings and books. It meant there was more and more rain, maybe bringing back life that had been devoid from the land for so long. As 9 studied the water, he suddenly spotted something small and limp on the opposite shore. He stared at it intently, studying this strange object through the dark. It looked extremely familiar, too familiar for comfort. And I needed to know what it was, and it was too dark to make it out. 9 slowly inched his way over the edge to the ravine and slid down the dirt of the bank. Coming to a stop before the river, he studied the water. There was no path to use to get across, so he hesitantly put a foot into the water, When he didn't feel any sort of pain that indicated he'd short-circuited, he eased himself slowly into the river. The water came up to his knees, but it didn't hurt him or corrupt his inner workings. However, it was freezing. Taking a deep breath, he waded deeper into the water until it came up to his hips. Giving a shudder of how cold it was, he found himself wishing for his light staff so he could see better in the darkness, and to give him a little hope. Hope that he was going to find them, be able to bring them back, and Seven was going to forgive him once he returned. 9 finally walked over the water, peering through the darkness at the object. It looked ragged and old. Nothing he should be concerned about. Well, this was stupid, he thought. He was about to turn away, scolding himself for wasting time, then something caught his eye. It was a small glint of light that got his attention. Walking towards it, he could finally make out the object and realize what it was. His heart jolted painfully. It was Tu's body, washed up on shore. The 1-pound coin was still on his eyes. His arms still crossed over his chest, as he once was. Long ago, his body had been virtually undisturbed. He lay just as 9 and the others had sent him to rest. 9 closed his eyes in grief, bending his head, and remembered the brief time he spent with Tu. His relief at finding him in the factory, the devastation when he died. No, he couldn't let this happen again. He was going to bring him back. Walking forward, he bent next to the delicate body of the elder. He gently removed the coin from Tu's eyes. As he looked to the peaceful face of his friend, his very first friend, 9 reached forward. He rested his hand on Tu's icy cold cheek, rubbing his thumb over the worn and rough burlap. He closed his eyes and sighed. So this is where it all started, with the stitch punk that had been killed first, the one who had given him his voice and saved his life twice, the man that had been his very first friend. 9 opened his eyes and began to work the seamstress bindings from Tu, knowing this was the beginning of his mission. End of chapter 3.